Good morning, dear listeners. This is Dr. Priyanka, and today we are going to start with types of variables. Before that, let us know what variable exactly is. Variables are things you measure, manipulate, and control in statistics and research. For example, you describe a person through his attribute, or you describe a place, thing, or idea. For example, in one experiment, you try to compare person's eye color from blue to green to black to brown. That is how a variable is. Variable is something which will be which will be changing as per the nature of the problem, nature of the person, or maybe depending on the situation. For example, you call a person's eye blue if it is blue. You'll be calling it as brown if it is brown. So it depends from person to person whether eye color will be changing or not. That is how it is variable. Variable can be divided into two parts. One is qualitative and another one is quantitative. As the name suggests, qualitative means we are talking about quality. We are not actually talking about just numbers. Qualitative variable would contain two kind of variables, nominal and ordinal. One more variable we can consider here is binary, which is categorical. Otherwise, we'll be discussing that categorical variable even in another slides, but still we can consider that here because of the so that we can understand nominal and ordinal in a better way. Nominal basically is just to categorize two to three things. For example, whether it's a nuclear family or a joint family, that is nominal. Uh, Nominal basically is the variable you can organize in more than two categories that do not follow a particular order. It is not anything like you are just categorizing things, male, female, or single or joint family, or maybe you are just trying to differentiate two colors, red or blue. This is actually called nominal variable, when you are just giving numbers on the base, just categorizing the things. But when it is ordinal, you are trying to compare the things. For example, you might measure level of satisfaction in three stages: unsatisfied, neutral, and satisfied. So these are three levels, and these three are comparable. These are just not numbers 1, 2, 3. These are different uh, different levels of satisfaction, and on the basis of that we are giving numbers 1, 2, and 3. But whereas in nominal, what we were doing, we were just numbering the things, we were just categorizing the things. That is why we even call it as a categorical variable, nominal one. And ordinal is even called as comparable variable. Then quantitative. When we talk about quantitative variables, these are any data sets that involve numbers or amounts. For example, it might include height, distance, or number of items. Height can be measured and it is basically continuous, right? Or distance can also be measured. That is also a kind of continuous one, but still we'll be dividing it into parts: discrete and continuous. Discrete is any numerical variable you can realistically count, such as the coins in your wallet, money you spent on anything, or uh, or I just mentioned like height, distance. These things are discrete, you can actually measure them properly. Then continuous. These are numerical variables that you could never finish counting, such as time. You can never finish counting it. This is continuous variable. You can find out ratios with that. This is the maximum used variable while doing parametric studies. When we talk about numbers, when we talk about empirical studies, this is 100% used. At least one variable would be continuous. Then major category is, one more major category is dependent or independent variable. What do you mean by dependent variable? As the name suggests, that variable is dependent on something, and independent variable is a variable which is not dependent. How would we define dependent and independent variables? Let us define independent variable first. Independent variable is a singular characteristic that the other variables in your experiment cannot change. For example, age is an example of independent variable, where someone lives, what they eat, or how much they exercise are not going to change their age. Independent variables can, however, change other variables. In studies, we generally try to find out whether an independent variable causes other variables to change, or if it is a yes, then in what way, or up to what extent. This is how independent variable is. We'll discuss it with the help of an example as well after discussing all the variables. Then dependent variable. What is a dependent variable? A dependent variable relies on and can be changed by other components. A grade on an exam is example of an independent variable because it depends on factors such as how much you sleep, or how much you study, how long you studied, and how many books did you study, so as to check whether you got the grade on that basis or not. Independent variables can influence dependent variables, but dependent variables cannot influence independent variables. Here, this is a very good example of good grade in marks, that if you study well, then you will be getting good grades. And this is actually true. Then there are other variables which would be considered while conducting any kind of the study. When we talk about generally variables like qualitative, quantitative variables, categorical variable, these are general variable. We are just defining a variable, that how it is. We are just trying to tell the quality of a variable. But when we come to the point of dependent and independent variable, we try to establish a relationship between these variables. When these variables are specially used in analysis, for example, correlation analysis, regression analysis, factor analysis, discriminant analysis, in these analysis, we have to define variables as dependent and independent variables, and some other variables are also there. For example, will the design answer the question? Is right thing being measured? These are the things on the basis of which we'll be considering other variables as well. For example, intervening variables. What is it? Intervening variable is a kind of mediator variable. It's a theoretical variable that the researcher uses to explain a cause or connection between other study variable, usually dependent and dependent ones. They are associations instead of observations. Basically, we will not be taking those observations, but we'll be defining them, we'll be associating them with other variables. These variables can be either categoric or continuous, both dependent as well as independent. Then one more example, you can say division is dependent, independent. Then we consider few more variables: treatment variables, measured variables, independent variable, controlled independent variable, and moderating variables. Then intervening variables, confounding variables, and extraneous variables. Let us study them one by one. Intervening, I just told you that it is a kind of mediator variable. It's a theoretical variable which might cause or connect between dependent and independent variable. Then next is control variable, moderating variable. Moderating variables change the relationship between dependent and independent variable by strengthening or weakening the intervening variable's effect. The variable we just discussed, intervening variable, that is nothing. But when we introduce a moderating variable, that might change the quality of intervening variable, and due to that, there might be effect on dependent variable as well. For example, in a study, looking at the relationship between economic status, that is independent, and how frequently people get physical exams from a doctor, dependent variable. Age is a moderating variable. Age can moderate that, because with age, with growing age, you might go for more physical exams to the doctor, right? So that particular variable might change other things in the equation through intervening variable. Next is control variable. Control or controlling variables are characteristics that are constant and do not change during a study. They have no effect on other variables. These are basically just to control certain conditions. For example, when you are studying a company for over 10 years, you might keep its one or two of its major properties as constant, as control, so that even if they affect, they will not be affecting dependent variable directly. Then extraneous variable. Extraneous variable are those factors that affect the dependent variable, but that the researcher did not originally consider. Some variables are that like that, extraneous. We can uh, see it by its name, that it's a kind of extra variable which we did not consider, but this is really very important. For example, a study assessing whether private tutoring or online courses are more effective at improving students' Spanish test scores. Extraneous variables that might unintentionally influence the outcome include parental support as well as knowledge of another foreign language. We never we might not even consider that either of the student might have knowledge of another foreign language, or their parents might be from foreign, or they might be supporting the kid, right? So this is also one of the important variables while discussing their Spanish test scores, right? Then there is one last variable, that is confounding variable. This is the one you did not account for, that can discuss another variable's effects. Confounding variables basically can invalidate your experiment results by making them biased or suggesting a relationship between variables which actually does not exist. This particular variable generally is giving you false hopes or false results. That is why this is very much taken care of, that which kind of the variable it is, you should identify them. Then composite variables. This is actually a variable, it's two or more variables combined to make a more complex variable. For example, overall health is an example of composite variable. How? If you use other variables such as weight, blood pressure, chronic pain to determine overall health in your experiment. This is how health would be a composite variable. Categorical, again, it is either you can call it as nominal variable, or you might categorize it as male or female, or sometimes we categorize age in different parts, like young age, medium age, or old age. For example, 20 to 30, then 30 to 40, and 40 to 50, right? This way we can categorize age as well. Sometimes we categorize height below 5 to 6, and above 6. That can also be done. Sometimes we categorize income as well, right? Income in such field, like if we are going to analyze something related to income or their spending behavior or something like that. Then quantitative we discussed, it is just numbers. Independent, dependent, these are very important variables and we are going to use them throughout the study. Categorical is also very important. Then mediating, moderating, confounding, and control variables. These 8 variables, these variables are going to be used in throughout the study, throughout all the chapters of this particular subject. Example of variables. For example, you are talking about a patient who has asthma or not. Asthma is a dependent variable and it would be dependent on so many things, whether what weight the person carries. That is also independent variable. Height, independent variable. Ethnicity, independent variable. Subsequent exposure, that is independent variable. And medical history, these all are independent variables, and this, on the basis of these, we'll be able to identify whether the patient has asthma or not. On these bases we can actually decide. So this is how we'll be deciding dependent and independent variables. Height cannot be dependent variable whether a person has asthma or not. Weight cannot be the dependent variable in this case. Ethnicity cannot be the independent, cannot be the dependent variable. But yes, asthma is that particular variable which is affected by all of this. If someone's weight is very high, very much more, like if you are very fatty, then you are more exposed to uh, more likely to have asthma. If your height is less and weight is more, then also you'll be more exposed to this particular thing. If you go for more exposure, if you are more exposed to dust and some such areas which are not green, which are more polluted, then you are more likely to have asthma. So these are the things. Your medical history, for example, it's not very good, you don't carry very good immunity, then also you are more confined, then also you are more exposed to this particular disease. So these are the things which we consider while deciding whether this is the dependent variable or an independent variable. For example, plants grow faster in warmer temperatures. Temperature and plant growth, two things are there. So what would be the dependent and what would be independent variable? Temperature is independent, right? Temperature is not dependent on plant growth. We cannot say temperature is high because plant growth is good. No, we will be saying that because of temperature, plant growth is good. That can be done, right? Or to what extent does traffic affect a person's mood? Can person's mood affect the traffic? No, not at all. But traffic might affect person's mood. So traffic here is independent variable and dependent variable here is mood. So this way we will be deciding dependent and independent variables. Let us discuss some questions, some true false. Number one, income is an example of a variable. Is it? Is income a variable? Yes, it is a variable. So it's true. Continuous variable, next is a continuous variable is one that can take on a range of values that correspond to some quantitative amount. Is it? A continuous variable is one that can take on a range of values that correspond to some quantitative amount. Yes, continuous variable is that. So it is, again, it is true. An independent variable is a variable that is predicted and or explained by another variable. Is it true? Is independent variable explained by some other variable? No. Dependent variable is actually predicted or explained by other variables. So it is false. Independent variable cannot be predicted by other variables. Last, in research, anything that varies or changes from one instance to another is called a variable. Yes, anything that changes or varies is actually called a variable. This is one of the very popular definitions of variable as well. So that's true. Multiple choice questions. A variable that can take on a range of values that can correspond to some quantitative amount is called a categorical variable, B continuous variable, C classificatory variable, and D independent variable. If you don't know the answer, you can read the question again and then answer calmly. Variable that can take on a range of values that correspond to some quantitative amount is called a, we are talking about quantitative amount. That means this is not categorical, this is not classificatory, but it can be continuous or independent. So let us read it again. A variable that can take on a range of values that correspond to some quantitative amount is called a range of values. That means we are just talking about variable normal quality. We are not going in detail of dependent or independent. So that means this is a continuous variable. So answer is B. Next question. What type of variable is gender? Gender is what kind of variable? A continuous variable, B primary variable, C dependent, and D categorical variable. Is gender a continuous variable? It has no value as such. Primary variable, no, it is not very important variable to consider in every kind of research. No, so that's a no. Dependent variable, it cannot be dependent variable on anything. What is your gender? It is not dependent on anything at all. Then categorical variable. Yes, gender is a categorical variable, male or female. We just categorize it for studies, just to compare sometimes males and females viewpoint on anything. Then self-assessment questions. Number one, define the variable with example. How would you define a variable? For example, age, height, your weight, all the things around us are variable. If you look at things from this point of view, from variable point of view, you'll be able to find everything which you might call as variable, almost everything. So you just have to give a definition of variable and give example. It depends on that how much marks you are going to get for how much marks are needed for that particular thing, or what how the examiner has asked you in one, I mean 1 point or 2 point or in an essay. Accordingly you will be answering that, but try to give good examples so as to score good marks. Second is list down the type of variables needed for regression analysis. I told you at the time of presentation as well that at the time of regression, in case of regression, what kind of the variables we'll be needing? Regression basically, though we'll be we'll be doing this particular analysis in detail in some other chapter, but I'll tell you what regression is. Regression basically is a tool or is analysis which will be setting some association between two variables, and it will be telling you that how one variable affect others. For example, how much advertisement expenditure affect the sales of a company. This is a kind of regression statement. Sales over here would be your dependent variable, and independent variable would be advertisement, because the way you will be spending on advertisement, it will be affecting your sales. So sales here is getting affected, that means it is a dependent variable. And which variable is affecting the sales? That is your advertisement, expenditure on advertisement. That means expenditure on advertisement is a independent variable and sales is dependent variable. You can consider some control variables, some moderating variables, some confounding variables as well. But two major things needed for regression analysis is dependent variable and independent variable. Last is compare. Yes, one more important thing is there might be a variable which might be dependent for one study and that is independent for another study. There are some variables which behave differently sometimes. So you might have considered one variable for your study which is dependent right now, and that might become independent variable for another study. That happens. Last is compare and contrast continuous variable, categorical variable, dependent variable, and independent variable. How would you compare these variables with example? Continuous variable basically is basically continuing number, age, height, weight, and whereas categorical is it is not actually numbers. We categorize things and we just give numbers to just remember the category. For example, we categorize gender, male and female. We just give number 1 or 2 randomly, right? So that is a categorical variable. But when we talk about continuous numbers of something, for example, age, you can define you can always write age in numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 100, maybe more than 100 as well. You can define weight in actual numbers, you can define height in numbers, you can define your income in numbers. These are continuous variables, whereas gender is a categorical variable. For example, color specifications are categorical variable. For example, some choices you choose one thing over the other, that is also a kind of categorical variable, right? Then dependent and independent variable. Dependent variable is the one which is depending on something, and independent variable is the one which will be affecting other variable. So independent variable is, for example, like we discussed, age is independent variable. Age is not dependent on anything. Your age will grow irrespective of anything. Like we say, time will pass on irrespective of anything, whether you do something or not, age will grow, right? But dependent variable might be your height might we, yes, it is up to some extent. Your height is dependent on your age, your weight is dependent on your age up to some extent, not exactly 100%. Your medical conditions sometimes are dependent on your age, yes they are. So these all are dependent variables, but age here is independent variable. So this is how you can compare them, and you can give examples also. Thank you.